am in Hillsborough on our project. I will briefly share what the project is and why we did it, and Laura will talk about the how, the project methodology and outcomes. And Laura is going to be the navigating the slides. So next slide, please, Laura. Okay. First, though, a little bit about Pacific University. Founded in 1849, Pacific's main campus is located in Forest Grove, Oregon, approximately 25 miles or so from Portland, west of Portland. Beyond the core traditional liberal arts curriculum through the College of Arts and Sciences, we have colleges of business, health professions, education, and optometry. Pacific currently has approximately 300 full-time faculty. Of course, that number varied a bit during the project's time frame, which we'll get into in just a moment, but not by much. As you can see, we definitely have a unique mix of offerings. The image you see in the slide is of the Tran Library on our Forest Grove campus. Next slide. So what is the research project? Well, using the Web of Science database, we analyzed the bibliographies of Pacific authored publications in 2 10-year periods. The first period being 2009 to 2019, and the second period being 2010 to 2020. Why twice? Well, we really wanted to see whether there were changes to the number of publications and their respective bibliographies. We thought it would be worthwhile to take a closer look at 2020. Next slide. I'd like to talk about the mission. Our mission is that the libraries is a central hub for academic support, study, and community at Pacific. And in fact, our mission is to advance critical inquiry, collaborative learning, and knowledge creation. And we do this by having dynamic services, spaces, and collections. Next slide, please. We were wondering then just how the libraries supported and advanced this knowledge creation. So we asked ourselves 3 primary questions. Next slide. Question 1, what knowledge does Pacific create? Question 2, next slide. What is used for that creation? Next slide. And the final question, do we make it available? And kind of a side question, and how? Next slide, please. As librarians, we're constantly trying to understand which resources are most valuable and useful to our patrons. We have a variety of traditional metrics for digital and physical resources like page views, downloads, and checkouts. These metrics, though, only show that users were tentatively interested, not whether the resource was actually useful and usable. With this project, we were able to take a look at not only what was used, but what also is valued enough to be cited in published works that created at Pacific. Next slide, please. Well, I think it's an understatement to say that 2020 definitely was challenging. We were curious then whether those challenges extended to productivity in publishing. We wanted to find out. And the next slides will briefly go an overview of those challenges. Next slide, please. Well, as many libraries have experienced, and we heard earlier from one presentation, we also closed our doors for 6 months, relying primarily on our online collections to provide access to resources. Instruction, campus-wide, pivoted to online in spring of 2020. Fall of 2020 and then the spring of 2021, we saw hybrid instruction and a soft reopening of the libraries. So the main difference between 19 and 20 was the pandemic and the subsequent closure of the physical spaces. Next slide. So one of the questions we asked ourselves is whether moving to online-only access had any impact on research. Next slide, please. Another factor, and again, one of many libraries also experienced, is that we reduced our collections budget, which meant canceling several databases that had full text availability. Nexus Uni and ProQuest Central were among those canceled. Next slide, please. Given the cancellations, we wondered whether this action also had an impact on academic research. Next slide. While we really don't have enough data to definitely conclude that moving to online only or that database cancellation impacted research output, we felt it's important at this point to ask those questions and to continue to ask those questions. Next slide. Well, now here's Laura to explain more about the project's methodology and the outcomes. So take it away, Laura, and thank you.
Thanks, Lynda. As Lynda was saying, we felt now is an interesting time to share this project, especially since it's an interesting time to be collecting this data. So I'm going to talk more about the methodology. So our methodology was focused on Web of Science because Web of Science provides citation information and citation relationships among publications. So information about, say, which article might cite other articles. We also have a subscription to the Social Sciences Citation and Science Citation Indexes. And so one of the things with that is that we're looking at data that focuses in those areas. There are other disciplines that are represented at Pacific, but for example, faculty, dance faculty might produce scholarship that don't follow the same patterns of scholarship as in the social sciences and the sciences. For example, if they choreograph a dance, they might not have a formal works cited section. So we felt it was appropriate to focus and represent this project with those two subsets of data. Our subscription also covers 1976 to the present. And Web of Science, as you may know, is a citation and abstract database only. It doesn't provide full text. So in the data we're reporting to you, we're sort of relying on the citation data that they provide and its accuracy. We haven't actually gone through and checked directly. I also want to mention in terms of data that there are plenty of other data sources for citation relationships. We chose Web of Science because it is a fairly authoritative source, and it also has a very wide disciplinary selection covered within it. So, as Lynda was saying, our main question is, do the libraries advance knowledge creation? And we broke that down to 1, what knowledge does Pacific create? 2, what is used for creation? And 3, do we make it available? So we used a technique called web scraping. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, web scraping is collecting information from the internet using software that simulates web browsing. Basically, most of the things that you can do in your browser, you can use web scraping to do and to collect data from. So this opens up a wide variety of data sources, and it's commonly used in things like big data. We also used Ruby, which is a programming language or a set of commands and instructions used to create a software program. So it's similar to things like Java or Python. However, Ruby is what's considered a high-level language, which means it's very concise. You don't have to write a lot of code. And it's fairly readable. It's in fact often used to teach people how to program because it is by some considered to be easy to learn and fairly intuitive. So within Ruby, we used a tool called Water, which is called a Ruby gem. And Water stands for Web Application Testing in Ruby. But it's basically a set of functionality or instructions that you can use to do specific things. So Water lets you use selectors to do things like click buttons. enter data into forms, and copy content from a website. So for those of you who might not know what selectors are, when you have a web page, each web page is built out of elements, individual elements, and a selector can basically help you select a specific element or a set of elements. For example, you could select all of the paragraphs in a web page, or you might select the first paragraph or the paragraph with a specific identifier. So that's kind of the broad overview of water. I have a couple of lines of code here to help show what I'm talking about. So the first line of code says browser.textArea. So that's basically telling your browser to look for all text areas, which is another name for the little word box that you enter search queries in. And then it's specifically looking for the text area with the ID input 1. So that's this one. And then it's telling the browser to set the value of that text area to be UT equals plus number. So pretty much it's entering some search query into the search box. The next line of code is browser.buttons. So again, telling the browser to look for buttons and then specifically select the one with the ID search button and click that button. So hopefully this example with only 2 lines of code helps sort of show how you could start to look at a variety of different data sources and interact with them in a way that you couldn't do without these tools together. So this is just one tool that can be used for web scraping, but it's the one we selected. And it opens up, again, more data that you can collect and analyze. So what we specifically did to answer our questions for what knowledge does Pacific create, we did just a very basic Web of Science search. So we searched for publications or works with the organization Pacific University and with the address Hillsborough or Forest Grove or Woodburn or Eugene. And that's because many institutions have both the words Pacific and University in their names, so we wanted to be fairly specific there. And we also searched within the time span 2009 to 2019 because we wanted to get an idea of what's happening over time. And also more recent data tends to be, or more recent metadata tends to be more complete. So for example, if you looked up sources in 1976, although the subscription covers it, it might not have as complete metadata. So the result of all this was a list of Pacific publications or publications by people at Pacific University. The next step was to answer the question, what is used for creation? And to do that, we used web scraping. So basically our steps were, we started with a spreadsheet which had that list of Pacific publications. And from that spreadsheet, we pulled out a unique identifier. We searched Web of Science for that unique identifier, went to the article page. And if you can see on the right-hand side, the article page, there's a section called cited references. So we were able to go in and download the cited references and then sort of with all of those files, create a huge list of all of the works used in Pacific publications. And I will say while we're here that this is most accurate for journal articles. Some other publication formats or forms of scholarship don't have that same citation relationship data available. So things like books or meeting abstracts might not have citations attached to them. And then also some entries, like the second one shown here in the cited references section, don't have complete data. So this is one where the title is not available. So for things like this, we didn't include them in the analysis because we're not able to say one way or the other whether we provide access to that item since it's not got enough information. So our third step was to answer the question, do we make it available? And again, we used web scraping for this. So we took that spreadsheet that had the list of works used in Pacific publications, and for each one, we pulled the DOI if it was available and did a search in our discovery layer for that DOI, and then sort of took the information in our discovery layer about whether or not it was available and the data source or the availability source. If the DOI search failed or was inconclusive, then what we did was try another search using the source, which for, say, a book might be the book title, and for a journal article might be the journal title, as well as the year. So we included the year to try to get some specificity and make sure we were looking for the right source. And so that gave us a list of works used in Pacific publications available through the library. So we want to go over some caveats before getting into the results. First, what we're presenting to you is dependent on the source data accuracy. So again, we used Web of Science for the information about the citation relationships. And then we use Boxer Search or Primo, which is our discovery layer for information about the availability. Also, I want to point out that this is data collected at a point in time. So since the time we collected that data, and probably going on right now, all of that data may be changing, especially the availability data, which we'll see. Secondly, a lot of the citations may be incomplete, or not a lot of them, but some of them, especially with formats like proceedings or books, where traditionally citations are not included in Web of Science. And last, we did have a focus on the social sciences and sciences, both because of our subscription, but also because of the way scholarship is published in those disciplines. Those disciplines tend to have more of an emphasis on articles which are rich in that citation data, as opposed to the other scholarship formats, which may have less citation data. So now I'm going to go over our results. And for most of these results, we're sort of looking at 2019 versus 2020. So we're comparing two data points. So we're trying to start to identify trends, although at this point with only two data points, things may change. So the first thing we did is take a look at availability. And this is comparing the availability for citations from Pacific publications from 2009 to 2019, and the availability in 2019 on the left, as opposed to 2020 on the right. So what we found in 2020 is that there was a 9% decrease in availability of those citations. And if you remember Lynda talking about the budget, that can pretty directly be traced to database cancellations that resulted from the 8% decrease in budget. This is fairly similar, but we also took a look at the availability in the last 10 years. So comparing availability from citations for 2009 to 2019, in 2019, and then also comparing the citations from 2010 to 2020 in 2020. So for this, we saw a 6% decrease in availability. So that's interesting because there's a little bit more availability for recent years. So you can see that budget had an impact, but it was mitigated by the decisions that our library and our librarians made to try to focus our cancellations on areas that are less used currently. We also took a look at publications per year, and this type of information, of course, is available through Web of Science without any type of programming. So you can see here sort of the publication pattern at Pacific University. And you can see both that we may have fewer publications than a large research institution due to our size and our scope, but also that Pacific has had an increasing focus on scholarship through the past few years, and an increasing number of publications through the past few years as well. We also took a look at publications per month. So you can see in red the number of publications each month throughout 2020, and in green for 2019, starting with 1 January and ending with 12 December. So we found this very interesting because you may notice that through January and February, there are more publications for the month in 2020 than 2019, and then that switches in March. And so there are more publications in 2019 than 2020 from March through about July or August. And then it switches back. So we found this interesting because those just happen to be the same months when both the university and the libraries were closed physically, and we're going through significant changes in the way that we just deliver research services and instruction. So that to us was very interesting, although we have to know two things. One is that we do have fewer publications than larger institutions, so these numbers may not be as significant. And then also, because of the nature of the publication cycle, which is a little bit longer to go through the whole process of doing the research, writing the paper, submitting it, getting it peer reviewed, and then finally publication. We probably expect that some of the impact in terms of publication counts might be seen a little later on. So we might suspect that this swap is maybe due to things like a slowdown in the peer review or publication process. But still, you can sort of start to see with both of these lines that there's sort of like an annual publication cycle going on at Pacific. We also took a look at the authors of these specific authored publications. And so it's interesting to us that in 2019, there were 267 authors and non-Pacific collaborators. And in 2020, there were 338. So if you remember back to our number of publications slide, there was an increase of 8 publications in that time frame, but an increase of 71 authors and collaborators. So that's very interesting to note. We also took a look at the author's productivity in terms of whether they published a single work during the year or multiple works. And so we found in 2019 that 84.3% of the authors published a single work. And in 2020, 91.1% published a single work. So a higher percentage of authors only published one work during the year as opposed to multiple works in the previous year. So that to us was also sort of interesting. Another way of saying this is that in 2020, authors published 1 to 6 works, and in 2019, authors published 1 to 7 works. And so there were 1.21 works per author on average in 2019, and 1.13 works per author average in 2020. In contrast, when we looked at the number of citations per publication, in 2019, there were 38.7 on average citations per publication. And in 2020, there were 47.9 average citations per publication. So this is interesting because it appears to be a significant increase in the number of citations people are using in their articles and other works. But this could be due to something like, for example, the fact that meeting abstracts don't usually have a lot of citations. And in 2020, there could have been fewer meetings and thus fewer meeting abstracts. So it'll be interesting to monitor this trend in the coming years. But also interesting if there is a trend that more publications are using more citations, because that means that at the core resources that the libraries are providing, all of the articles and publications they're citing are very important to the process. We also, as Lynda mentioned, took a look at how things are available. And so we have a database analysis for our institution. But we thought it would be interesting to share what was available through open access more broadly. So in 2019, 18% of citations were available for free, the citations used by Pacific authors and their published works. And in 2020, 20% of the citations used were available for free. So it's interesting that that's increasing. And that, of course, could be either because in general, there's more open access availability, or it could be that there's preferential use of open access materials. Although we do again want to mention a caveat, and that is that in August of 2020, our discovery layer, Primo, switched its index to the Central Discovery Index. So that could also sort of have an impact in what things could be discovered in terms of open access. Now I want to give you a quick summary of what we've been over. And again, these are preliminary results. So we saw an increase in the number of publications per year, which seems to be sort of on trend for us. We saw a decrease in the number of works per author, which could be maybe reflecting the increased amount of labor involved in transitioning things for our faculty or the publication process. But we also saw an increase in the number of citations per work, per article, say. So that's interesting as well, because it could mean that more research is happening as part of the production of these articles. And finally, we saw an increase in open access or use. So to take it back to those questions Lynda introduced earlier, how does online-only access impact academic research? Well, that's to be determined. Like I said, we have sort of 2 data points so far, but we were wondering, could any of the changes that we've seen so far be attributed to online practices? And those included increased publications institutionally, decreased works or publications per author, increased citations, or the increased role of open access. Our second question was, how does budget impact academic research? So we found that despite our attempts to mitigate the impact, the budget does impact availability. And so this is, of course, something we want to limit. We want to make things as available as possible, but also it demonstrates that taking away budget, we can numerically show has an impact on availability, and that has an impact on the core scholastic and research functions of the university. So we also asked ourselves, could this be why open access citations increased? Because maybe resources that were formerly available were no longer available. And so open access might provide an alternative. And secondly, we're aware of the fact that the publication process is usually a little longer. So for example, if people started their research at the end of summer, that research may still be working through the process of, say, being written up, being submitted, undergoing peer review, and then being published in the end. So we may continue to see impact of this budget reduction in terms of productivity down the years. Okay, and lastly, I want to say a couple words about availability studies and this type of research. So it began as sort of a manual process, which of course was incredibly labor intensive and was usually infrequent or partially done. It might focus, say, on a single discipline or department at a large research institution. Recently, in the past few years, parts of this process have become automated, so that opens up a lot of opportunities. More institutions are able to do this type of research because of that. You may have noticed that Pacific is a smaller institution and has a liberal arts focus as well as the health professions. So with more institutions doing this type of research, we can start to draw out more comparisons between those institutions. Also, as we've demonstrated here, since it's an automated process, it can be done more frequently. So, for example, it could be done annually instead of once a decade. And third, as we go on, we might see more data sources available for things like that citation relationship information. So I know specifically that there have been availability studies done with other data sources than Web of Science for that relationship data. And also there may be more platforms built that have that sort of information in the future. So it's possible that other studies could be done that had either an even broader scope with more data sources, or perhaps a narrow scope that focus in really well on a specific area. And lastly, as we've tried to show in this presentation with the types of questions that we're answering and the data that we're sharing, automating availability studies provides longitudinal opportunities. So you can say, go and monitor how open access is impacting availability of these cited works over time. So altogether, these provide a lot of opportunities for institutions to do some research and then see collectively, perhaps in the future, how availability and library research sources may impact scholarly publishing. So to sum up, we analyzed the references that Pacific authors used in their research and whether they are available through the libraries. And our conclusion was that they mostly are. So even with the budget drop that we shared in availability, there was at least 69% of those citations were available through Pacific University libraries, mostly online. And when you factor in things like interlibrary loan and resource sharing, which isn't included in that 69%, there's actually a lot of availability in terms of scholarly resources through the library. So we hope you found our presentation interesting, and thank you for listening. I think we can now answer any questions or comments that may have come up.
It looks like we do have one question from, and thank you so much, Lynda and Laura, from Tom Dodson. Thinking about making work by Pacific University faculty specifically to learners and scholars within and outside the university, the data you're collecting could be extremely useful in identifying work for deposit in the university's institutional repository, specifically final manuscript versions, which are much easier to distribute. Has the library considered linking this data gathering project to effort to make work accessible through the IR, Institutional Repository, I believe? Faculty could also be made aware that openly accessible work is more frequently cited. Have you considered an open access policy like the one at Harvard and the other institutions?
Yeah, so some of that I can answer since I provide some of the technical support for the institutional repository. So I think this past year in April or so, we actually finished a migration of our institutional repository. And let's see, this spring we're working on an upgrade. So one of the things we have been discussing is whether it would be appropriate to see whether we can do any sort of harvesting of what's available open access and feed it into the institutional repository, but we haven't reached any conclusions on that discussion yet. In terms of, I think the question about sort of faculty outreach and policy regarding making deposits more mandatory or more encouraged, I think that's still sort of an ongoing discussion. As far as I know, I'm not necessarily part of those discussions. And Lynda, I'm not sure if you have more information in that area.
No, I don't. Not at this time.
It's definitely, though, an interesting thing to think about in the future.
Well, thanks, Laura and Lynda. We have another question from Hillary. Have you presented this to your faculty or heard feedback from them about this study?
So sort of yes and no. Last spring, right before the pandemic started, Lynda and I shared the first year availability analysis with our Provost Council. So that was sort of interesting. And I suspect that they had other things on their mind because this was sometime in mid-March or April. So we didn't share that aspect, but we haven't shared this most recent set of data widely. This is the first time sharing it because we had to wait until 2020 ended to do the data analysis. It would be interesting to get their response, though.
Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any other questions. There are some notes in the chat from Tom summarizing that the work wouldn't have to be open access. Final manuscript versions of the journal articles can almost always be made openly available in an institutional repository, and that the database Sherpa Romeo often has this information. So
yeah, well, that's definitely a good tip to look into after our upgrade of the IRA is complete. Thanks for sharing that, Tom.
Well, are there any other questions that anyone has? Please feel free to go ahead and enter those into the Q&A. Laura, Lynda, any final words from you?
No, this is Lynda. I do have to compliment Laura. She did do the bulk of the work. I was more of a brainstorming partner with her. So Laura is the one that did the technical work when she was talking about the we. It's more of a royal we, but she did the lion's share. So.
And of course, the nice thing about automation is I delegated most of that to my computer. But really, it was very interesting to see the types of questions that we can start to ask and answer with additional methodologies.
It was actually really fun to see the data and then take a look at the data and then take that information and interpret it. That was really fun.
Fascinating. Thank you so much.
And thank you. And thank you, Laura.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening.
Well, with that, we're going to wrap it up. And thanks so much, everyone. And we'll see whomever.
I think we have one more question.
Oh, thanks, Jeremiah.
Yep, it just popped up.
Yeah. Are there resources to read to get up to speed if we want to make a study like this from Hillary?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are sort of two answers to this. There are a couple of articles which I don't have at my fingertips that are sort of about the process of automating an availability study with different data sources. So those are available. And then in terms of how to use sort of Ruby and Water, both of them have fairly good documentation that you can find if you just Google water spelled with an I instead of an E.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you, Jeremiah, for sharing. And then also another note from Tom is if you have LinkedIn Learning at your institution, they have some trainings that are terrific. Tom states for programming languages. So thanks, Tom, for sharing that. And then, sorry, not another question. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.